Hello, I'm Sheila Bender from Writing It Real, and today I have with me the author Helen Donnelly Goehring, who wrote the article that we posted last week. It's an excerpt from her book, Transformed by Grief. She shared with us the essay called Mother, and she's going to talk about that and about her writing and how it came to be. And I'm just really grateful that Helen can join us today and that you can meet her in person as I am, as in person as we can get these days. So welcome, Helen, and thank you so much for participating.
Well, thank you, Sheila. It's a delight to be here. I'm really honored, and it's just a continuation of our relationship going back a number of years when I signed up for your series. I think it was started when you taught at Hugo House, and so I became a member. And one day I responded to an invitation to participate in a contest, and I was just amazed that I won second place. And it was an essay called, I'll tell you in just a minute the name of it. It was called Taking Notes in Assisted Life. And it was about my experience working at Horizon House, a retirement community in Seattle. And I just followed people around for a day, and whether it was residents or staff, and listened to their stories. And it was a very easy thing to do. And so I was really just amazed when I won this prize. And so that just sort of launched Sheila's and my relationship. And I'm so pleased that I'm able to participate now in talking to you about my book. And I was telling Sheila that, I never imagined I would be writing a book. I mean, here I am, 88 years old, writing my first book. And, most of my writing before I met Sheila had been on political activism. I was very concerned about the degree of homelessness in Seattle. And so I started writing a series of op-eds and letters to the editor, to the PI, and the Seattle Times. And I was so surprised that they published them. And I have a whole file full of these going back, 20 years. And so I decided after that, I might just take a memoir class because I had written this article, on my mother's death, and I thought I might expand on it. So in the memoir class, they asked us to write about a loss that we had had. And so I shared this in small groups, and they teared up and said, this is really quite a story. And so I shared that and a number of other losses I had as a child. My mother at 16, my first boyfriend at 14, and my best friend at 7. And so that was just sort of the beginning of this effort to write a memoir. And then I taught this class at St. James Cathedral. It was actually a workshop called The Transformative Power of Grief. And it was for those who had experienced loss themselves. And it was all women, and there were 13 of them. And so every week they read one of my essays, and then they would break up into small groups and discuss it. And they all had experienced significant losses themselves, and it gave them an opportunity, some of them for the first time, to talk about these losses. And so that sort of was the launching of the book. They kept saying, when are you going to finish that book so we can get a copy? So I like to say that along with this writing, it's so important to do a certain degree of reading. I have a whole collection of books on grief. There are just so many out there. And I'd like to just share with you some of the writers who have really influenced me in crafting this book. The first is C.S. Lewis, the British writer and theologian, who lost his mother when he was 9 years old. And I could really relate to what I was going through with him, because in his book, A Grief Observed, I'm going to quote now, he said, and he had a younger brother, he said, "To us boys, the real bereavement happened before our mother died. We lost her gradually, as she was gradually withdrawn from our life into the hands of nurses and delirium and morphia, as our whole existence turned into something alien and menacing as the house became full of strange smells and midnight noises and sinister conversations." I just think that's a beautiful description of what these boys were going through. And it reminds me so much of what I experienced with my mother's illness, that we never talked about it. She was very ill with Parkinson's disease. She got it as a relatively young woman. I was 6 years old at the time. She died when I was 16. And it was before L-Dopa, which is a medication that makes such a difference. So she looked like she was 80 years old when she was 40. And, there were all kinds of whispers behind doors, that I overheard. One of the most traumatic was the day that my sister, Peggy, who was 5 years older than I was leaving for college on the East Coast. And this is back in my hometown of Evanston, Illinois. And my father came in, knocked on the door, and he said, "I'd just like to have a word with you." I knew, boy, this is going to be something serious, because when he talks to us like that. And he said, "I just want you to pray for your mother. It's not as if she's going to die or anything. I just want you to pray for her." And then he closes the door. And I burst into tears and told my sister, "She's going to die." And my sister tried to talk me out of it. But then we go to the train station, and, I hold the tears back. And then we go to, on the way home, we're all very sad, my sister leaving. And my father says, "Why don't we stop off at the Ringling estate?" Their house was being auctioned off. And it was just a few blocks from us. And they're having a sale, and maybe we'll find something there that we like. So I'm standing in front of this painting, this marine painting, beautiful painting. And two of my mother's bridge partners were in front of me. They didn't know I was there. And they said to each other, "Doesn't Marie," my mother's name, "look terrible? And poor little Helen doesn't know her mother is dying." So I heard that. They bought the painting, by the way, the marine painting. And so I say in the essay on my mother, I sat there that night looking out over Lake Michigan and wondering what is going to happen to our family. I was so frightened. So those are the kinds of experiences that, just took such a toll on my life. It just affected the way my relationships, my education, all through high school, I was just sitting there in a daze, because all I could think about was my mother. So C.S. Lewis, was really, he and I were very much in the same mode, I should say. And then another one who influenced me was Hope Edelman. And Hope Edelman wrote a book called Motherless Daughters. And she has a website she is always giving workshops. She's continually writing more books. She went to Northwestern University in Evanston, where I went for my first 2 years of college. And her mother had died a few years before. And she said she was so embarrassed by the fact that her mother had died, she couldn't even tell her friends that she didn't have a mother. And she paid a price for that years later. And so I quote her a number of times in the book. One of the quotes is, "The teen is caring for her mother when she needs someone to care for her." And you know, I was giving my mother shots after high school. I'd come home every afternoon, inject this medication into her arm. You know, I gave up my summers so I could stay home and take care of her, even though she had nurses around the clock, but I still had to be there for certain things. Hope also said, when a mother dies too young, something inside her daughter always feels incomplete. There's a missing piece she continues to look for, an emptiness she keeps trying to fill. And I think most of my life I've been trying to fill that emptiness. You know, a mother is so crucial to a child's well-being. And, you know, I just finally at this stage of my life, I'm recognizing what a profound impact it had. And then the last author I quote here is Elizabeth Farnsworth. And Elizabeth, a lot of you may know about Elizabeth. She's often on the news. And she wrote a book called A Train Through Time, A Life Real and Imagined. And she talks about the message her father gave her when her mother died, when she was 9. She died of breast cancer. And he just came in one day and said, "We lost mother last night." And now, I mean, Elizabeth is a foreign correspondent. She travels all over the world. And she says, proximity to her suffering and death made me accept insecurity and also assertively embrace life, which I knew from experience to be fragile. So those are some of the writers who really influenced me in crafting this essay on my mother.
So I want to say that I'm happy that you shared with us the impressions that lingered from when you were 16, the painting, the conversation of the women in front of you, the way your sister, the way you hugged when she said goodbye, the way your sister tried to convince you that what you knew was true wasn't true, and how you looked out over Lake Michigan. All those moments are the ones that make the piece so evocative, that we can really feel who you were then. And of course, that means we can feel who you are now. So I'd really love to talk a little bit more about the idea of transformation through grieving, because you already moved from, in your conversation about the quotes, they moved from being like you, the child who's not really being informed, to a psychological in-depth revelation that when you lose your mother, something is never satisfied or fulfilled in you, and then to the idea of some transformation. The last author you quote talks about a recommitment to life, fragile as it is. So I thought that was just beautiful, the way you reached back to C.S. Lewis and moved forward. And I wonder if you might tell the readers a little bit more about your choice of title for your book, Transformed by Grief. Do you want to address Transformed?
Yeah, so we think of grief as a negative, it's emotion, and it's really something that can be healing. It's essential to grieve the loss of a loved one, and it's never too late. And so by transformation, you know, you really there's a sentence here, I think, that describes it very well in the back. So this is a series of essays about the transformative personal growth possibilities in the grieving process. And even though they're individual essays that stand alone, the narrative is the same. They demonstrate how the process of transforming grief can vary. And yet, despite the variations, the common thread and common purpose of transformation is always evident. So it's my hope that the reader will acquire a deeper sense of life and loss through these essays. So I think that transformation in this book, at least, means that you will develop a deeper sense of life and loss. And that, to me, I think is a positive rather than a negative. Is that?
That's a good answer, because we all know somewhere in ourselves that our time here is limited. We've witnessed that in other people. And yet as a culture still predominantly, although we're getting a little better, we predominantly don't pay attention to that. And it's when we don't pay attention to something that's so authentic and so true to life that we get skewed in directions that aren't very fruitful. And I think by pointing that out with beautiful essays about loss, we're giving people permission to really feel what they know to be true. And when you feel sadness and deep grief, you can also feel joy. But if you block out those negative feelings, what we call negative feelings, then you suffer. You suffer the inability to reach out the opposite feelings. And so it's a beautiful description of why. So thank you. And I also noted when I was reading your manuscript that you invited your daughter to write a foreword, which I thought was, when I first read that, because it said Transformed by Mom was the name of her foreword. And I just thought, oh, wow, this is something that's a legacy, very much a legacy, not just the book and the words of her mother, but as I read the introduction, I mean the foreword, I found out that the mother's way of living and sharing is definitely a legacy beyond just the book. And so one of my favorite lines in the book goes something like, and in the foreword is, the book you are holding in your hands was authored by the author of my being. And it's just, for me, so poetic. So as a daughter, my mom's 94, as a daughter and as a mother myself, my daughter is 47, maybe she's 46. You lose track of time in these times, don't we? I felt really in the middle of all of that and so edified just by that one sentence. And I was wondering about your choice to ask your daughter to write that forward.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, Sheila, because it was a big decision. I wasn't sure who would write the foreword. I mean, not every book has a foreword, but most books on grief do. And so, and a lot of the forewords are from people who are well known, you know, could be a minister or a priest or a grief counselor. And so I talked to my editor. I had an editor to help me with this book. And she said, I think it should be your daughter. And I thought, wow, you know, I never really considered that it could be a family member. And she said, I think your daughter would be ideal. And I mentioned this to Katie. And she said, well, Mom, before we even consider, I think you should talk to Ashley. So Ashley is one of the editors of America magazine. And that's a Jesuit publication. Even the Pope reads it. And I had an article published there, which was really very exciting for me that they accepted this article that I'd written on my Jesuit volunteer year. I came out to Seattle from Chicago at the age of 68 to be a Jesuit volunteer working with the homeless. And then I stayed, I never went back. So Ashley is a wonderful writer and editor, and I really think she has good judgment. I asked her and she said, your daughter. So I said, Katie, you know, are really important people here, professionals who think you should do it. And she kept saying, no, it's not, I just can't do it. And so she just felt it should be somebody well-known, an expert on dealing with grief. So finally, she talked to her boyfriend, Scott, and he said, you've got to do it. You don't say no to your mother. So I'm so glad I won this battle, because virtually everyone who has read this book, Sheila, has said that this is one of the highlights, that this foreword is just so really, I think it's profound, and it has so many different, it goes in many different directions. I mean, she starts out talking about Mr. Rogers and, you know, and then the author of her being, I mean, it's all over the emotional spectrum. And it brought us, the process of her doing this really was healing for both of us. It brought us closer together. And what was hard for her especially is because, you know, I have been recently diagnosed with multiple myeloma. Well, about 2 years ago I was, which is cancer of the bone marrow. And so she feels that she's, you know, there's a chapter called Me, and she knows that, you know, I mean, I'm 88 years old. She's looking at my, the possibility, you know, it's not only possible, it's very likely that I'm going to die someday. And this is very difficult for her to accept, understandably. And so writing this was quite a profound choice for her, and I'm just so grateful.
So I want to say that it's profound for the readers because it adds a whole additional layer as you're reading the book. Not only are we hearing from the author about her losses, but we feel the love between the two of them, and we know she's an elderly, the author is an elderly person. So everything you just described is there in us as we're reading the book. And that's why I say it's a legacy. So any writing we perform is a legacy to the reader. But to have this relationship revealed early in the book just deepens that idea of legacy, of sharing our true feelings with the people most important to us. Yours with her and all of us who read the book, and her with you and all the others who read the book. It's just, it's a magical thing. So I like that all these people who were asked were unanimous and had not even any minute to think. They just seemed like, well, of course. And that is miraculous, because you don't have those kinds of things happen too often where everybody agrees that this is the right direction. So that's a wonderful, wonderful story. And I like to ask authors, and thank you for telling us about the book, its evolution. I want to tell Writing It Real members that if you have not yet read the essay, please do. It was posted last week, so and it remains up there forever in the Writing It Real archives, but it'll certainly be listed on the homepage for weeks to come. Click over on Mother by Helen Donnelly Goehring, and you will not regret spending any of the seconds and minutes it will take you to read this wonderful essay. And then click over, there's a link there to Amazon where you can find the book itself. Your writing is so clear, so full of specifics, like the ones I mentioned before, so full of occasion and purpose. And your story about needing the affirmation of others, newspaper editors, contest judges, a teacher in a memoir class, colleagues in a memoir class, all of that rings so, so true. That is our experience. I mean, we write because it's in us to write, but we write in order to be heard. And in doing that, we hear ourselves more. So it's this constant loop, which is really important. But a lot of us get stuck at different parts and we stop the loop. We think we can't write anything as important, or we think that no one will like our writing, or we think we're not up to it. This is a big job you have for yourself to write about these losses. And loss is such a big thing. I know it was true for me in writing about the loss of my son, that I had these feelings of, I could never write something as important as the loss of my son. So why am I writing? And then you find out, in my case, and I think to yours to some extent, you find out you're writing almost in honor of them. They would want you to write. They would want you to remember. They would want to read the book. So that is the first step. And then you find other people are saying, can I borrow this if it's just in draft form? I'd like to show it to my sister. I think she'd benefit from this. And it happens a few times, and you got that in your class for sure, the one you're describing at UW. That happens a few times, and you realize you're going to have to do the hard work of writing because it matters. It matters a lot. And that's one of the things we learn ultimately as writers. Our writing matters. It doesn't matter if it matters to one person, 5 people, 10 people, our family. It matters. And usually if it matters to one person, it matters to way, way more. So I just wanted to thank you so much for telling your story, for enlightening us about how things came to be, and for sharing those wonderful quotes and the names of the authors that you did from your reading that really hooked you into knowing you'd be able to speak too. So I want to praise you for not getting stuck in that wonderful miraculous loop of writer to reader to writer and back. It's just, it's a miracle, and you're a miracle. And I
Oh,
just want to thank you.
well, thank you, Sheila. It's been such a delight for me to participate in this and an honor. And let me just say that you're never too old or too frail to write a book.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. And most of us, since we are living longer and get good treatment like you are,
Mhm.
most of us have the energy to do it. And maybe the time, things get a little easier in terms of, you said, if you write, you just got to write all the time. And I could just feel some people saying, oh, but I have a job. Oh, but I have a husband. Oh, but I got a house.
Well, there's always an excuse, but
Yeah.
especially now with COVID and so many of us are at home, this is a wonderful way to just bring creativity into your world.
Right. And I wanted to say too that your book is a collection of essays. And I think one of the things as we get older, we might want to concentrate on is, in order to write a memoir, we don't have to write the story like it's a novel and take all that narrative time and narrative arc, and all that stuff. We can be more like the poets are. Poets put volumes of poetry together that are made up of poems written over decades sometimes, and then find a way to put them in the same book with an emotional arc. And I think many of us can begin to think of our essays and our poems and even a mixture as something that could become a book and be a meaningful legacy of our time here and our time with others. So just want to thank you again. It's been really, really wonderful to
Well,
talk.
thank you. It's been a real privilege, and thank you for everybody who tuned in.